In today's episode, we're in conversation with Staci Belcher, who is the founder of Nutrition Made Well, a private practice centered around helping clients heal their relationship with food and their body. Staci operates from a weight-inclusive lens, focusing on helping clients heal their relationship with food. She is informed by internal family systems therapy, which allows her to address the emotional and physiological aspects of eating and wellness. Stay tuned to find out more about her insights on the latest developments in weight-inclusive care. Staci Belcher is the founder of Nutrition Made Well, a private practice focused on eating disorders and disordered eating. She teaches clients how to attune to their body's physiological cues and integrate nutrition science with their unique body experiences to discover peace with food and their body. Welcome, Staci.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And such a pleasure having you on. So, Staci, I first want to start out with, and I ask, almost all of our guests who come on, is why this, right? So, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background and what really grew your interest into this space for nutrition?
Yeah, it's so funny. I had a roommate in college who received a book for her birthday on how to eat healthy in college. And I sat and read the book cover to cover in one afternoon and was so struck by how approachable, accessible, and just like this seems like such a approachable way to be. And it kind of sparked my interest of like, wow, I could teach people this. Now, I think I had a budding interest in nutrition throughout my adolescent years, but that really solidified, oh, this is a job. Like I could help people be, approach nutrition in a really accessible way. The challenge was my school didn't offer a dietetics degree. And so I transferred to the University of Florida. I became involved in undergraduate research. I pursued a master's degree at the University of Georgia and really began to hone my expertise in nutrition research alongside this interest I always had in nutrition counseling, building a long-term relationship with clients, and kind of being able to witness that transformation as someone makes these bite-sized changes to their lives. And here I am, 10 years post my undergraduate degree, and I still love nutrition. I still love being a dietitian. So it was a great serendipitous choice that set me on a really awesome life path.
And, to our youngish listeners, nutrition is not a new concept. We talk about it almost often. I do want to provide the perspective from the nutrition counseling side, though. It is a myth around like, oh, most of this stuff I can just Google, I can just find, right? Help us understand a little bit about why nutrition counseling is so important. What are some of the core tenets within which nutritional counseling is offered?
Yeah. Nutrition counseling is so important to help, number one, streamline the priority of goals of, say, someone has a very specific new nutrition related diagnosis, medical diagnosis. The expert in the room, so to speak, the dietitian, is able to say, okay, here are some top priorities that we should hit on. And then the client then can take the lead of, okay, those feel really important to me, but let's focus here. So the dietitian can create an environment, number one, to investigate the life of where are these changes going to need to take place? What are the ripple effects of how that's going to impact routines, rhythms, family systems that might not love new foods coming into the dinner rotation, as well as be there as a source to motivate and also celebrate. That's one of my favorite things to do with clients when they come back and say, I made these changes and these really positive things happened for me, whether it's small or new labs that show improvements in markers related to their chronic condition. So in my world, I specialize in disordered eating and eating disorders, and the role of the dietitian is to really help investigate beliefs about food, correct any beliefs about food that might not be scientifically correct, as well as look around, like I mentioned earlier, look around their life and say, how is this going to impact the way you engage with the rest of your day? Because changing nutrition habits can be stressful. It can evoke a sense of anxiety, overwhelm. Sometimes folks experience shame or guilt when they're eating certain foods. And so having that nutrition counseling space built into their schedule, they're coming regularly, allows them to know I'm going to be able to explore this with my dietitian. She's going to help me understand and clarify what's happening for me. And two, pave the way with the client towards the life they want. That's the beautiful piece is we get to hold the vision that the client has and help them get there. And that is one of the greatest honors in the work I do. Certainly we have lots of tasks involved in the nutrition counseling, outpatient dietitian world, but being able to hold that vision and help someone get there is such an honor and so amazing to witness and be that support for clients.
Mm-hmm. And so what I'm also hearing from you is not only about the nutrition knowledge and information, but it's also about getting the support along the way, setting up goals, helping individuals meet those goals. And if you don't meet those goals, that's okay. Going back and resetting goals if needed.
Oh yeah.
Right? Yeah, right. So within that, help me understand. You just talked about eating disorders and disordered eating, which I know is a little bit different from sort of general nutrition counseling. Help us understand, and we've talked about this on a couple of episodes of the Yumlish podcast before, but help define for us the difference between these two concepts, why that's important, and the role that you're playing as a dietitian in really helping navigate those journeys.
Yeah, I love this question. And I think it gets down really to the essence of the specialized approach we might take depending on what the client is coming in with. And so for someone who's struggling with their relationship with food, where I really start with them is getting a very clear understanding of what are their beliefs about foods, what foods do they avoid, and also what emotions are evoked when they eat any particular food. Now, I might be a little biased. I certainly think this is important across the board. We know that many adults struggle with disordered eating behaviors, even if they don't have an eating disorder. So I would say this could be a great thing to pull in no matter what you're counseling with. However, my approach allows for us to dig in really deeply with those areas, and then from there identify what are the barriers to feeling ease with certain foods, perhaps foods that in the kind of modern food culture, people might say are quote unquote bad foods, but we want to make sure that our clients are able to eat foods with ease and comfort in a balanced way, that they don't feel stress around foods. And so sometimes in nutrition counseling in the eating disorder and disordered eating world, the homework for my clients is to have exposures with these foods that cause stress. Over time, that stress will reduce, and then all of a sudden, they can have more ease around that food. It isn't as activating to their nervous system to have any particular food that may cause stress. And so a lot of times my clients eat a very nutrient-dense diet, and we actually want to make sure that there is full balance in that diet. They can approach foods with flexibility, with ease, that they can go out to dinner and not stress about what's on the menu. So it is perhaps a little bit different, but the core tenets of can we make sure there's balance on the plate? Are we prioritizing nutrition? Are we prioritizing mental well-being and physical health? And I always think too about accessibility. Like we have to think about someone's life. If they're very busy, that's going to impact. If they have lots of time to cook, that's going to impact what they're choosing. So taking that full centered approach of how can we think about the whole person when we're pursuing these nutrition goals.
Mm-hmm. And there's something that you talked about earlier, which was around how common and prevalent some of these eating disorders are. So help us understand a little bit around that, because I think the general view tends to be, it is something around anorexia or bulimia. Like those are sort of the common ones that we hear about from the media and other avenues. But help us understand how common this really is, and how does it really show up in a person's life?
Yeah, eating disorders affect millions of people every year. The most commonly diagnosed eating disorder at this time is binge eating disorder. And we do see an increased prevalence in folks identifying as female rather than male. But in terms of what we see kind of in the counseling room, we notice compulsive behaviors around food or body. So that might be overeating or undereating particular foods. We might notice a maladaptive relationship with exercise. So they might compulsively exercise or use other techniques to regulate their nervous system. If they're feeling anxious or stressed about their body size, then they turn to one of these coping behaviors that can have some negative health impacts, especially if someone's under fueling. And so when I say that many folks struggle with disordered relationships with food, that might mean they're avoiding particular food groups, or they feel like they should be avoiding particular food groups. We can kind of think about the impacts of diet culture generally on this, but they might feel bad if they have a dessert. They might feel like they didn't do a good job if they don't eat enough nutrient-dense foods, or they might feel pressure that they have to change their behaviors in a way that doesn't align with the cultural foods that they love or just the foods they grew up eating. And so when we're looking at, say, a general population, those are the questions I'm asking every client, because I don't want them to feel stressed when they're eating foods. I want them to feel ease, and we can pair the nutrition education with that to help reduce some of the stress around those foods.
You mentioned one of the common ones is actually binge eating, and we don't sort of think about that when we're thinking about eating disorders. Help us understand, what are some signs, symptoms, not to self-diagnose, so just to be very clear, but what are the types of things that we should look for within which we should think, okay, now is a good time for me to see a dietitian?
I love this question. Because a lot of what we think about with a formal diagnosis is the intensity of symptoms, the intensity that symptoms are experienced, the frequency, and or whether or not the behaviors around food have led to negative health impacts. But all of those occur on a spectrum. And so if someone is experiencing a lot of stress around meal times, if they're finding they're avoiding food groups or restricting the total amount of calories they're eating in a day, if they're feeling that they're unable to socialize without thinking about food, if someone's having a lot of negative body image experiences that then lead to manipulated food behaviors, if someone's struggling with behaviors like purging or utilizing laxatives, I always say a dietitian can help anywhere one falls on the spectrum. If you find yourself with the drive to purge after eating a particular food, that is enough to say, let me call a dietitian that specializes in this, a therapist that specializes in this. No one needs to suffer. No one needs to wait for a diagnosis. There's a very common phrase in the nutrition and eating disorder world that clients don't feel sick enough to pursue nutrition services or seeking out to a therapist. That doesn't exist. If you have any unease around food, that's enough to see a dietitian.
And, when you mentioned that, how do you differentiate it from, oh, you know what, I'm not eating well because I have stress at work, or there's this, or it's like an external, you know what I mean? Which is more like, oh, I've got this other thing going on is what it is. How do you help differentiate that?
Wow. I love this question because it really hits a nail on the head of when we talk about motivation or when we talk about how we identify with our eating behaviors. And kind of chewing on this a little bit, I wonder if it really has too much of an impact on ultimately the behaviors. Like if we say, okay, I'm skipping lunch every day because I'm too stressed at work, well, you're still skipping lunch every day. And it might be that the root of that is a little bit different. So the root maybe of someone experiencing a disordered relationship with food might be anxiety or fear about their body changing if they eat lunch, versus the root of someone experiencing stress. They might not be hungry for lunch because their hunger and fullness cues are impacted. So when we can investigate the roots of the behavior, then we can begin to see, okay, that feels a little different. But sometimes what happens for folks is they might have a life event, say an intense stressor at work, that leads to a decreased appetite at lunch. They stop eating lunch, their body might change. They might receive feedback from others. You look great. What are you doing? I wish I could not eat lunch. And then that might have a negative feedback to them. They might then start to feel nervous about, well, what will happen if I start eating lunch again? I might no longer receive this praise. I might not be witnessed as one with discipline and self-control and motivation. And so then it can get really tangled really quickly for people. And that can be, my experience with clients, that is a common etiology. For whatever reason, their body size got smaller, maybe it was an illness, XYZ, and they received that positive feedback. And all of a sudden it became oh, should I keep doing what I'm doing? And I'm certainly not saying that's a quote only cause, but it can be a factor that impacts people as they're going through life.
What are some common or some recent developments in the nutrition space itself that have really captured your attention recently?
I really appreciate this question. One thing I've been keeping an eye on is the conversation that's happening between ultra processed foods and mental health. There have been some recent publications talking about food addiction and ultra processed foods. And my priority with my clients is to deliver the science to them in a way that's understandable, that's applicable. I educate every client on the neuroscience of feeding. It was my favorite class in graduate school, and every single one of my clients knows how the hunger pathways work, how the satiety pathways work in their body, so the satisfaction pathways. And so I want to have a good, clear understanding. What are the definitions of these food, ultra processed foods in the scientific literature? What is the research saying? And keeping my clinical hat on, what is helpful information? What is harmful? Where do we need more evidence? So that's been something I've been keeping a very close eye on, and I think is going to be an important conversation. Sometimes I feel like I'm, pulling these conversations in innately because I do talk about that neuroscience of feeding, the nutrient composition of food as well as the flavorings. So salt and sugar impact our taste buds immediately. We have longer term satiety pathways that are triggered once we begin digestion. So my clients learn about that, and we can then talk about, okay, how does a really palatable, tasty food that comes out of a bag how does that food impact these pathways? And it's something that's really essential in our modern food world. We do have access to foods that are quick and easy, and that's a huge convenience and a huge help. And how can we explore how that impacts our food preferences, the foods we enjoy eating, our cravings? And I don't believe we need to demonize. I think we can sit back and observe someone's kind of food landscape and understand the role that they play individually in their lives. But at the foundation of that for me as the clinician is investigating the evidence.
And when we hear about ultra processed foods and just like this, the convenience of food that sort of comes around, we try to, sort of pull back on some of that to then incorporate some of the fruits and vegetables, like some of the less processed, sort of widely available foods. What are some of the challenges as you're exploring some of these things? What are some of the challenges that patients tend to face in creating that new relationship with food? Because a lot of these processed foods are cheap, right? They have a lot going for them. They're tasty. They feel tasty. They, and I say they feel tasty for a very important reason. But anyways, they feel tasty, tastier than, oh man, eating a salad. Like, how boring is that, right? But how do you then sort of recalibrate that relationship back and help people understand or help people develop a more positive relationship with less processed foods?
I'm giggling here because one of the things I try to do is hijack how they make the food so palatable. And so I'll start talking with clients about how do we mix salt and sweet and savory? How do we cook foods? How do we incorporate texture? How do we incorporate flavor and the experience of eating to bring more joy to you? So that might be adding acids to food. So for example, lemon juice, salad dressing, those sorts of things. It might be utilizing, the magical pairing of a fat source, a sweet, and a salty. Again, I'll use a salad dressing as an example. That can create all of a sudden a new exciting flavor that someone maybe hasn't had before. And so I think there is an element to this conversation of that requires access to nutrition knowledge, resources such as time and money in order to prepare foods in a way that are really tasty. Some of my clients come feeling like they don't like, a certain variety of foods. And what I try to create in my office is, okay, I hear that and I honor that. And can we open up a little bit of open-mindedness to say, perhaps I don't enjoy the food the way I've had it prepared before. We know that consistent exposures to food can increase someone's palatability towards that food. And so if I can just create an environment my client feels empowered to, hey, order the Brussels sprouts at a restaurant. Those chefs will make them in a way that's tasty. Just give them a try. Maybe we can see what you liked, what you didn't like, and perhaps implement some of those things at home. And so I tried to create a lower pressure environment to say, It's okay if you don't like it, but let's create a routine that you're consistently trying things. And think about foods in alternative forms. So you might not love an apple, but you might really enjoy an apple that's cooked down in your oatmeal. So we talk about all the different ways someone can try foods raw, cooked in different ways. The air fryer is a really fun one to explore in terms of roasting different types of vegetables and creating new flavors and textures. So open-mindedness, I think, is number one. And two, you have a whole lifetime to help adapt your taste buds, which actually happens quite quickly, our taste buds adapting. So there's no pressure of we need to do it tomorrow, but rather a shift towards, can I invite more foods into my repertoire of eating and be okay if along the way I encounter some that might evoke a momentary a moment of lack of pleasure, or ooh, that texture was a little weird. Can we become a person that observes that and experiments and move on?
We wouldn't be Yumlish if we didn't talk about diet related chronic
Yeah.
conditions, right? How does weight inclusive language, or even what we talked about with foods and sort of creating that positive relationship, talk about that impact on diet related chronic conditions? I'm talking about diabetes, sort of cardiovascular disease as well. How do you incorporate some of that messaging overall health?
Absolutely. Number one is, I really have experienced that using weight inclusive language and really just more neutral language in general. An example I like to give is, instead of saying exercise, I might say movement. And so just using more neutral language that hasn't been, inundated in the client's mind through years and years and years of doctors or media or that sort of thing, can create an environment of, how can we look around your life, understand where you are, and then focus on the behaviors that we know can support and help really improve A, how you feel today, but B, the treatment outcomes in the future. A lot of times clients go, oh, you're not going to just tell me to lose weight. And I refocus to say, no, let's dig in deeper. Let's think about blood sugar regulation, balancing meals and snacks, moving your body in a way that feels good. And the beautiful thing is, when we focus on behaviors, the client innately can find that source of motivation of like, oh, I can do that. I can definitely do that. Or maybe they came into my office feeling totally overwhelmed and scared of this new medical diagnosis they just received. And so I that being said, welcome conversations about weight. I do have clients that say, I want to lose weight. And I never say, no, right? I say, let's talk about that. How do you feel in your body? How does your desire for weight loss impact your motivation? How does it impact your medical visits? How can we honor your body today, even though it's not what you want it to be? Because that can be so challenging to find the motivation to pursue health behaviors that might feel tricky or might feel complicated. And how can we make it something that is accessible and approachable while honoring their goals, whatever they might be, and the fact that we need to do what we can do today and help you today.
And from what you're saying, it really seems to me like, when we think about just weight loss, we're only focused on a number and getting to that number. But in what you're saying, and in the approach that you're taking, what I'm really taking away is that now you're thinking about the why. Like, why do you want this? It shows up in a number, sure, but what is your why? What keeps you motivated, and what gets you on a more positive pathway rather than this roller coaster that can be our weight sometimes, especially as a woman? How does this approach really impact that, again, that relationship with food that people have? What are some of the long-term things that you hope, expect, or even see today, again, as folks develop in that relationship?
My favorite phrase to say to clients is, hopefully you don't need to see a dietitian forever. Hopefully we can equip someone with the skills, the understanding, the insight to take the learnings. Of course, it can take time, right? Like, we can come, we can set goals, experiment. But ultimately, what I teach my clients to do is understand how their body works in the context of, with someone with a chronic disease, understand how their disease works in their body and the tools that they need to take throughout their life. Their context, their environment, their body actually will always be changing, right? Like, we go through, especially as you mentioned, women, like, we go through these distinct phases of our hormonal physiology that impacts our energy levels, our interest in food, our hunger, our bones, all sorts of things. But if they have that foundational knowledge and they've built the skill of self-compassion, observational exploration without judgment, they can take those skills their whole entire life. They can take that with them. And maybe they would want to pull in work with a health coach or a dietitian along the way to say, ooh, I'm really struggling pulling in weight training as I am aging to help support my muscle mass and my bone health. Let me get an expert on board, but they know that that is something that's really supportive of their health. So I hope that my clients have the confidence to ask for what they need and to the ability to look inside and feel like they're able to encounter what's there, whether it's fear or stress or anxiety or a little confusion or confidence. They might feel that confidence inside too.
I love that. On that note, Staci, thank you so very much for your time. At this point, can you tell us how can our listeners connect with you, learn more about your work, just stay in the know?
Absolutely. So I write on a Substack called More Soon, and I write about well-being and nutrition, of course. I'm also on Instagram at Staci, that's STACI, RDN, and nutritionmadewell.com.
Lovely. And what we'll do is we'll link up everything in the show notes so folks can have access to just scroll down in the show notes, find for this podcast post, and you should see all the hyperlinks there. So with that, Staci, thank you so very much for your time. This was such a great episode. I got to learn a lot and really got to understand sort of some of these things that we hear about in terms of eating disorder and disordered eating. And again, that can seem very removed, but at the same time, very connected in to our day-to-day and our well-being. So thank you so much for shedding light on this. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into another episode of the Yumlish Podcast. You know what time it is. Head over to our social media on Facebook, on Instagram, and answer this quick question. In your food world, what brings ease and what interrupts your ease? All right. So again, head over to Facebook or Instagram. You're going to find us at Yumlish. Find this podcast post and comment below again to tell us, in your food world, what brings ease and what interrupts your ease. We'll continue the conversation there with that, Staci. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Such a joy to be here.